Okay, before I begin about the history of this lecture, 10 years ago I submitted a paper for a festschrift that sat there for a while. 5 years after I had submitted it, I was called upon to submit another article for a different festschrift, so I thought I would build on the original article that I had written, referring to the original one as in press. The second one did appear in Moscow, and then when I was told I not only had to give a paper here, but I had to give a paper that could be published, I went back to the original festschrift, which is probably, if anything, become a Gedenkschrift after a while, and simply pulled the paper, thinking that 10 years was long enough to go completely out of date. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for giving me the opportunity to take a paper that probably should have been buried anyway, rather than seeing the light of day. This is going to be something completely different from what I did yesterday, and you'll have to bear with me, and there indeed are going to be moments in my lecture in which I'm going to ask certain members of the audience to please close their eyes and put their hands over their ears. Okay, let's begin. I am an archaeologist, card-carrying archaeologist. This is how I have made my living throughout my entire career. I am not a linguist. I have the professors of linguistics to prove it. They'll all attest to it. No, Mallory is an archaeologist. However, like any archaeologist, I am interested about using any technique possible to retrieve information about the past. And therefore, I give you two quotations here. One, of course, going back to Jakob Grimm, and a somewhat more recent one from Mari Haas, worked in Amerindian languages, that by and large whet the appetite of any archaeologist. They say that linguists, comparative linguists, can reconstruct something regarding the past that basically would make any archaeologist want to die for it. And I certainly understand where this attitude comes from. Because from the point of view of comparative linguistics, you, I suspect, believe at least that you can actually get inside the brains of the people who left the linguistic relics with which you work. So, in the course of this lecture, what I'm going to basically be doing is ask a number of questions. Some of them are going to be incredibly naive and stupid, but as an archaeologist, I think I have the right to ask stupid questions. I don't have any reputation to lose there regarding that. So, where this goes, God only knows. Okay, first, how many roots, more words, do we have in Proto-Indo-European? If we use our standard work, Picorni's Indo-European Etymologies book, it lists about 2,044 roots. Nevertheless, this includes a tremendous number of regional cognate sets. And I give you a quick example up there, good old Irish rook, tunic, and Old English rock. So we have a Celto-Germanic isogloss, from which we get a Proto-Indo-European garment, which, of course, you know, I don't think you could sell any linguist that we have actually a Proto-Indo-European word rue or anything like that. When I prepared, and this was the book I was working from, and that original festschrift, the Encyclopedia of Indo-European Culture, I count 1,364 words, which are lexemes of some sort or another, that we believed we could treat as Proto-Indo-European. Now, ever since the comparative method was begun, what constitutes a fully reconstructed Proto-Indo-European word can be disputed. The rule of thumb that we used in the encyclopedia and that I normally use is that I will call it Proto-Indo-European if it involves Anatolian plus one other Indo-European language, or if it has at least two cognates, one from what I will call the European camp and one from the Asian camp, realizing that by putting Tocharian in the Asian camp, I am, waving a red rag to quite a few of Tocharian bulls. But nevertheless, this is how I basically try to do it on terms of geography. If you go through that encyclopedia and you want to count up the number of cognates by language group, that is, who is giving us our images of Proto-Indo-European, this is basically the count that I come up with. It differs considerably from Bird's look at Pokorny, because that is primarily Germanic. Almost all of the categories would be Germanic versus Baltic, Germanic versus Slavic, etc. will be the major categories. This one shifts things back to Indic as being the leading category, and Albanian at the end. We'll have more to say about this in a second. If you plot this geographically, which you may regard as an absolutely mindless task, and I have only one reason to do this, because there is a school of thought who, upon seeing that, Indic, 925, clearly the Indo-European homeland must be in India, because it best retains the proto-language. We would then, upon looking at it, matched against the geographical thing, see that there is no correlation. If you start with India, then Iranian should be the next greatest, and it should fall off on a slope with Celtic, obviously, in the distant west, being the least well represented. Of course, there really is no correlation with geography. If you plot it against the age of attestation, other than the two outliers, where Anatolian may be early, but it disappoints in terms of the quantity of items it contributes to our reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, and Baltic, because it succeeds far, far better than the recentness with which we obtain things. You could, by and large, draw a diagonal line through it and probably come up with at least a vague correlation that your age of attestation does control to some extent your ability to contribute to our overall view of the proto-language. Now, what does the Proto-Indo-European look like? It looks like two things, by and large. On the one hand, we get barnyard Indo-European. What I call barnyard Indo-European. This is the Indo-European of Adalbert Kuhn and everybody like-minded, including myself. This is where we get our cows, sheep, goat, our domestic animals, our trees, words for agriculture, wagons, kinship terms, social terms, etc. That's one world of Indo-European, and of course it's basically nominal Indo-European, a series of nouns. But then we also have, as anybody who has poured their way through Pokorny, we get red balloon Indo-European. And it's a number, after countless pages, where you find that the underlying root means bright, shine, inflate, blow, swell, set in motion, invariably producing countless derivatives that only differ because they will have a suffix velar of some sort or another that has turned them into something else. And so we have red balloon. And there's going to be a tension. I'm going to come back to this a little bit later on regarding what I call red balloon proto-languages. Well, what are our best attested Proto-Indo-European items, ones that make it into all 12, subgroupings? It's a fairly limited number, and among the number that I give you there, water, cow only counts if you believe that Albanian is contributing to the Proto-Indo-European cow word. A few basic nouns, some numbers, and some pronouns. Now I thought, in order to give a certain amount of reality to a lot of this, I would compare Proto-Indo-European with the language of a suitably primitive, violent population known as American English. And consequently, I'm taking a look at word frequency indices for American English. And that's what you get, and it's pretty well what you would expect, a series of articles and basically pronouns. Obviously, things that would not be picked up in Proto-Indo-European, simply because of the morphological structure of the language. Then I decided to do something I wanted to explore. Don't worry that you can't read all of this. I'll make a few points as we go along. I wanted to take a look at the number of cognate sets per semantic field. And simply break things down into as many different semantic fields as possible and see how many words contribute to them. And at the top there, body 110, health and disease 79, speech and noise 75. These are the really big areas of semantic fields in Indo-European. And then we can go down to the really low ones, metals, you don't expect too many of those, to wash. Doesn't say much about the Indo-European. Clearly this is not from, again, sheer proof that it did not come from India. Fish, reptiles, and a few things like that. That gives, a trail of the number of cognates per semantic field. However, you can also count the number of languages contributing to each of these as well, and do the average number of cognates per item within a semantic field. That is, how much evidence are you going to be able to look at when you're working within a semantic field? Now, numerals, obviously, the sky, verbs to be, etc., up on top. The red colors, if you can read them, I have no idea from your distance, those are generally things that an archaeologist might be able to recover, or a paleoecologist. At the bottom, the sacred deities, positive values, vessels, and society. Society is down there. It is fairly weakly attested in terms of Proto-Indo-European reconstruction. And I'm reminded of Bertrand Schlerau's study, where he took a look at Beowulf and the Helion, from which he extracted 27 words that pertain to society, of which, in terms of English, only 2 have survived into modern English, Earl and King, and only 2 have survived into modern German, Schalk and König. And all of the rest of the words already, over the last 1,000 years, have already disappeared. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about this. There are semantic fields which seems to be far, far less stable than others in terms of investigation. But I thought I would do something totally mad. If I've got 1,364 words, and I'm presuming that we have been able to recover them because they have managed to satisfy some form of beauty contest, in the sense that they have been used more frequently and have survived better, then why not take also the first 1,364 words in terms of frequency of American English and compare the two. And that is just a basic thing. And take a look at body parts. If we do it in terms of numbers of languages contributing to the cognate sets, in Indo-European, feet come first, followed by heart, and then the eye. The same 3 parts of the body also occur, not quite in the same order, in American English. Foot, heart, and eye. Only difference here is the eye and the heart. If you take a look at the next ones in Indo-European, the tongue, the tooth, and the bone, these fall, as you can see, a little bit lower. Tongue falls to around 13th place. Tooth, they're well up there in American English. It tends to be the same thing. On occasion, we are going to get considerable differences. Hair, for example, in Indo-European is not nearly quite so important as it is in American English, but we can understand that. We can't reconstruct a single word for hair in Proto-Indo-European because they're making semantic distinctions between body hair, head hair, and things like that. Other times we find words in which we say knee, very well reconstructed across 10 languages in Indo-European, it ranks 3,900th in American English, and we have similar other things which differ considerably. And as a matter of interest to you, archaeologist in American English ranks about position 8,900, linguist ranks position around 22,000. You need an Indiana Jones if you want to raise your profile. If you compare the two statistically, and do just a very simple test on it to see who is being represented more than might be expected randomly and what is being underrepresented. In terms of Proto-Indo-European, compared to American English, we get a higher representation, either say of fauna, body and health, nourishment, motion. That's always tricky, comparing the quantity with because motion moves us into areas of red balloon Indo-European, and action, which as you can see there. And this is, I think, a feature of any proto-language. English, American English in this case, is more obsessed with time, with certainly quantity, position, thought, and unfortunately the index I was using also had some proper names, which obviously skews things considerably. Now, these were sort of idle things I was simply curious about. The next thing I hope is not entirely idle. The Indo-European languages had to spread, and they had to spread by migration. And they're carrying, these languages, as they're moving along, are carrying all of these different semantic fields with them. Now, in various models of Indo-European expansion, one might presume, I would think, that there should be some form of variation between the languages and their ability to retain semantic fields. If, for example, Indo-European spread at a time as lingua francas, trade languages, I remember there was a period in which, Creole and pidginization and everything else were very trendy explanations for Indo-European expansions. We might therefore expect the attrition of whole semantic fields, and others might be better preserved, this type of a thing. So I thought I might try to test that. So, and I don't expect you to be able to read that, don't worry. The fourth slide after this one, I'll make it clear. This is one of those moments where I hope Hans Holm falls asleep. I simply computed the raw scores for each language against my different semantic fields for how many were contributing. Compute the expected count by language group on the basis of the totals of columns and rows. Computed the chi-square value by language group as I'm simply comparing two nominals. And before I go any further, I'm well aware that sometimes my semantic groups were too small to do a valid test, but what the hell, I've got the computer program up, why stop then? So, what I am basically doing, for example, is if you imagine the semantic field and its land, Celtic contributes 3 lexemes to Proto-Indo-European concerning the concept of land, Italic 3, Germanic 7, Baltic 5, Slavic 7, and so forth. You can work out the expected numbers. I give them just below. They're fairly close to the ones on top. You compute the chi-square value. You ask the null hypothesis that the semantic field and the language groups are basically independent of one another. And you set up hypothesis 1, that there is a statistical association between the semantic field and the language group. You test it, and in the above example, there really is no statistically significant difference between the language group and the semantic field. Even though they may vary a little bit, it is not enough to be significantly different. What is the final result? Well, it involved, rows and columns with 672 cells, and you would have thought that one bloody cell among that whole lot should have showed some statistical significance. But basically, semantic field does seem to be independent of the language group. And this I find somewhat astounding. I'll give you an example here. Let's compare Indic, the most 925 cognate sets versus Albanian with 226 sets. I give you the basic comparison, but here I'm going to try to do it verbally. We're in the Proto-Indo-European homeland, and it is as if God appeared to the people before they began migrating. And it sat there and it talked to the people who were going to be the ancestors of the Indo-Aryans, and he said, you will go out into the world and you will have a fantastic religious ritual language which will be recited generation after generation, and it will preserve enormous amounts of the Indo-European vocabulary. And then it turns to the Albanians, to the ancestors. You are in trouble. Your language will be mangled, and by the 21st century, the only thing you will be are gangsters and Luc Besson films. And this is about it. Nevertheless, although I will deprive you of the great linguistic legacy of Indo-Aryan that I'm giving to my favorite side here, throughout every semantic field, you will still have this rightful proportion of words indicating your Indo-European status. Nothing will totally have collapsed. You will still be Indo-Europeans right across the entire semantic field. Now, this is the image that I get from doing this particular exercise. The important thing, however, is that I'm only looking at those words that have contributed to Proto-Indo-European. I have not looked at the full range of words that may have isoglosses across other groups. And that is what I did in the second Festschrift. And since it was published in Moscow, it's probably buried in most people's recognition. Where I returned to it, I'll just very, very briefly give the key element there. I used the updated Mallory and Adams, the Oxford. I collapsed these semantic fields, 17 semantic fields. And here I said, how does the regional vocabularies compare with the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary? And here I defined a number of different regions, and these are geographical definitions. They don't necessarily have to be linguistic by any means, but your famous Northwest group, because once you create a Northwest group, you have to have something in opposition. So I took a look at the basic semantic fields there. And what I computed there is the total number of cognates, and the number there was the Proto-Indo-European cognates plus every time I found a regional isogloss that did not meet the criteria of being Proto-Indo-European, but it could have been Northwestern or something, like our rock and Irish rook, that type of a thing. And took a look through all the semantic fields there, and obviously tried to plot out how much of the overall vocabulary might be regarded as regional. And a more interesting way of doing this was to contrast the Proto-Indo-European versus the regional, and then create basically an index. And the index there, as you can see, indicates that things like kinship and anatomy have very few new words added to them in terms of our comparison of Indo-European languages, whereas terms for textiles, materials, architecture, and particularly fauna and flora have clearly the highest indices. You can plot this out so you can see it visually using correspondence analysis, and I circle it. So there's two worlds there. We have ones that basically preserve Proto-Indo-European and add very little to it when they hit the semantic field, and we have others in which maybe only half the vocabulary that they're using in the semantic field is Proto-Indo-European, and the other half seems to be merely regional isoglosses. And this is the type of pattern one might expect, therefore, as Indo-Europeans began spreading. They're picking up words from substrates, they're carrying them along. These are becoming entered into the different languages. And what I'm trying to capture is how many times they enter two or more of the Indo-European languages. And then try to plot out the index values against the actual groups themselves. And by and large, doing a statistical test on that is not tremendously informative. The Northwestern group, by and large, is getting proportionally not a particular greater or lesser number, a little weak in anatomy. The West Central group, that means when you combine the Northwest with Greek and Albanian, you do get positive loading, considerably more words entering in regionally, particularly regarding things I think I've got down there for flora, agriculture, tree names, and things like that. And one of the other heavy loadings is in Greco-Aryan, and that's for religion, where terms that we only seem to find in Greek and Iranian and Indic. Now, how much is missing? When we construct our proto-languages, how much like a real language are they, and to what extent are they really just artifacts of the comparative method? How much are we losing? Well, I think the evidence clearly indicates that there is really collapse of semantic fields on a very large scale. For example, and I'll just use birds and fish from here. Darcy, Wentworth Thomas, his classic studies. He has 500 names of ancient Greek birds and 570 ancient Greek fish names. I admit many of them are lifted from Hesychius, so we often are going, God knows what in the world that language really was. But even if we were taking the old vocabulary for Old Prussian, it produces 67 bird names and 25 fish names. If you take the entire early Irish dictionary, the Royal Irish Academy, 65 bird names and 24 fish names. With the most optimistic will in the world, we can reconstruct a Proto-Indo-European, 17 bird names, and that is real optimism because so many of them are onomatopoeic, and about 6 names associated with fish in one way or another. It gives you an idea of the collapse. And I thought perhaps one of the easiest ways of doing it is through semantic display analysis. I simply went through the dictionary of the early Irish language, so it's going to be Old Irish, Middle Irish, and some early modern Irish. I took all of the words and I tried to arrange them in a display that indicates what medieval Irish society would have been like, semantically regarding cattle, its #1 animal. Semantically, what we're getting here, as you can see, is a lot of words indicating the generic cattle. We get calf, irrespective of gender, and then it bifurcates into the female, lots of words for heifers, even 2 words for a 1-year heifer, and then as they become adults, milch cows, a lot of terms for that, and even contrasting with dry cow. For the males, it can be divided into 2 groups, a male who's likely to produce young, and a male who doesn't have a chance in hell of producing young, with, I'm afraid, a loan word there, bull calves and bullocks producing bulls and oxen. So, we get a picture of what the structure is like there. Proto-Celtic, what do we have of that in Proto-Celtic? This is what we've got left, the handful of words regarding cattle in Proto-Celtic. We can do cattle, we can do calf, we can do heifer. We don't make a distinction between later milch cows or anything else like that. We missed the early tier of bull calf and bullock. Anything in red means we've lost the semantic sphere altogether. And if we push it back a little further to Proto-Indo-European, where the reconstruction, I will admit, is going to be troublesome in the extreme, we lose almost all the semantic categories that you saw that existed in the real language. And what we basically get is we get cattle and we get bulls of some sort or another, and that is about it. If you plot that out on a quick little table showing you the attrition, simply doing a quick count of the different semantic spheres, there is something there that I find very odd, and I find lots of this very odd, but I find it interesting as well. we get a lot of words, as you can see, in what we call the living language from the 8th century to 14th, 15th century. In Irish, 62 words. Proto-Celtic, we get 6. Proto-Indo-European, we get 5. Now, I expect a clear fall-off between the living language and the reconstructed proto-language. What I am surprised about is that the difference between Proto-Celtic and Proto-Indo-European is so little. I have no idea whether this phenomena would be seen if you took a look at any of the, the reconstructed proto-languages. As I began, here I am advertising Brill's excellent catalog. We could just simply grab them and start pouring through them and seeing to what extent the fall-off in our reconstruction is it time dependent? Because right now, the difference between Proto-Indo-European, where we're assuming we're going back maybe at least 5,000 years, and Proto-Celtic, which I do not think is particularly deep, and we're still getting roughly the same fall-off between the two. That, I think, is an interesting subject. Well, we're comparing and seeing whether this is a fluke or whether this will actually go right through as you take a look at the reconstructed branch proto-languages. There I started with language. Here I start with archaeology, or paleobotany, and ask myself this question. Let's take a look at the domestic plants from Neolithic Italy. And I simply give you a full list of those archaeologically recovered from sites. And on the one hand, you might look at them and say, oh yes, but many of these type of things that a botanist might make, but I can't believe a person in the field necessarily would know the difference between Triticum dicoccum and Triticum monococcum. They really are different. If they were a farmer, they should certainly have known what in the world it is they planted. They would have known it at a glance, looking into the field, what they had planted. If we take a look at what we have from Proto-Italic, anything in red, we simply have no reflex whatsoever for out of that vocabulary. In the case of barley, good Indo-European, hordeum, problem is, can't even be absolutely sure what the original referent was, given the fact that we have a cognate in Anatolian, our earliest language, and there it's returning the meaning wheat rather than barley. For the others, take a look at spelt, loanword, query, broomcorn millet, maybe Proto-Indo-European, maybe just simply created in Latin. Flax, loanword. Lentil, loanword probably. Bitter vetch, probably loanword. Fava bean, loanword. All these things basically regarded as sort of non-Indo-European words floating around, being borrowed by different Indo-European languages. In Berlin's study of agricultural societies, you took a look at the lexicons of 10 agricultural societies, and on the whole they averaged 520 botanical taxa per language. The amount that we get in Indo-European is a mere smidgen, fraction of that level. Proto-Indo-European, if they were behaving like any other language on the planet Earth, these semantic categories should have been fairly large. A final bit, ceramics. And by the way, I'm mentioning topics because these should be followed up. Looking for a topic, I believe semantic field analysis is certainly one of the ways to go forward, and it is certainly one of the ways archaeologists can talk with linguists. Anybody who knows Italian archaeology, it's ceramics from the word go. Of a wide variety of ceramics, of extraordinary different types, that each one of them must have had different names. If you take a look at the ceramics that have survived linguistically into Proto-Italic, there's a whole series of words that are regarded as loan words, calyx, catinus, copa, scutra, from shield or something like that. A few words that have no etymology, no known etymology, no comparanda. Some local formations like the mortarium, large vessel there. Possibly a cognate, but not at the level of a ceramic. If you want to compare the large vessel that was a Latin dolium with the old Irish word delo, which means form, which probably comes from Proto-Indo-European del, to cut or carve. It indicates the working of wood. not the shaping of pots, leaving you with one Northwest Indo-European isogloss for sieve, in which Latin, Celtic, and Germanic seem to share the same word for sieve. An item which dates as early as the Neolithic but continues on archaeological sites through the Bronze Age, etc. Now, finally, a little bit of comparison coming out of Indo-European and taking a look at other language groups. This sort of a distribution of Nostratic, for those who believe, and a Nostratic family tree in which we couple together most of the languages of Europe, Eurasia, and Southwest Asia. I played the same game. I took a look at Proto-Indo-European by semantic field and compared it with Finno-Ugric and the Nostratic, Alan Baumhard's dictionary. Don't worry, I'm going to collapse this. And basically played the same game. How do the languages differ in terms of major semantic fields? And here I try to use very large things. If you have a red color, you've got a negative loading. You're statistically coming up with less contribution than one might expect. If you get blue, it's a positive loading. For example, in terms of nature and in terms of action, Proto-Indo-European, by and large, is producing less compared with the other two reconstructed proto-languages. On the other hand, we take a look at speech, and we have images of Indo-Europeans incessantly chatting into the ears of taciturn Finns who have negative loading regarding speech as a semantic category in Uralic. On the other hand, where they find positive loading, it tends to be nature, flora, and fauna. And we can come up with, of course, all types of just-so stories to explain it. Uralic is hunter-gatherers, and therefore they're paying more attention to landscapes. These things have survived better. Trade, exchange, they're poor in, and of course they're borrowing words from Indo-Iranian, we know from Uralic. Nostratic, on the other hand, when we look at it, very curious there, because it is missing words for flora, fauna, and body and health. Now, body and health, in a way, is sort of one of my litmus tests. Is your reconstructed proto-language really solidly based? And these are the ones that should be holding on the best. And when you're not scoring high in body and health, I begin to wonder whether really the comparative method is producing a real proto-language. And when you skip down to where they are highest, action, we've moved into red balloon Indo-European. And whenever I see a proto-language that basically is emerging itself primarily in terms of a lot of swelling and movement and things like that, I become a little bit suspicious. I can skip to that, semantic fields of Uralic. If we take a look at the most frequent concepts in Nostratic, strike, turn, cut, swell, shine, split, burn. These are the numbers of lemma that begin with these forms. Stretch, cover, seize. It really is quite verbal. And for the Nostratic meanings, coupling them all together, I've just simply red means it's verbal and blue means nominal. And so Nostratic, we're either going to have to presume that the original proto-language was entirely built on verbal roots, largely, or this is simply a process of wishing a whole series of words into the same reconstructed proto-language. Now, in justification of it, nouns operate perhaps within a different system than verbs. Nouns tend to operate with meronymy, and that is they tend to be sort of little hierarchical clusters. You can have a foot or a paw, and then you have toes and you have toenails. But there's only a certain limit of it. If you go into a thesaurus, for example, I took a look at International Thesaurus, the sun, orb of day, day star. You don't get too many other words for it. Ear, auditory apparatus, and lug. teeth, dentition, ivories, pearly gates, but that's pretty well the limit. You look at a verb, and as you can see, for just the beginning, because there's plenty more after this, an awful lot of words. And therefore, possibly, to give Nostratic its due, we may be in this problem here that verbs spew nuanced verbs, and therefore we could expect those type of vocabularies. On the other hand, we may very well simply be dealing with what I would call dubious reconstructions. I finally took a quick look at homonyms. Now, of course, it's absurd to look at homonyms because God only knows how, how you can have a homonym when, like an Indo-European root, you've got two laryngeals. And, you know, you begin by making a sound supposedly like a cat being squeezed around the throat, and you end by making a clearing of the throat sound like a dog dying and having eaten too much. And these things have to be compared with one another. But if you pretend like you're doing what we'll call visual homonyms, and we take these are classic ones, you know, this is from according here, to sleep or to tear off, to flay, this type of a thing that we regularly get. If we look at Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, and you go through the indexes, you're getting something on the order of about 10% homonyms. If you look at that same list of English words that I was playing games with there, 8 to 14%, depending on what you regard as a homonym. Over half of the reconstructed vocabulary of Nostratic is homonyms. Consequently, on. Now, I admit, you can have trouble. I mean, I have enough experience with Mandarin Chinese to know when I've opened my mouth, if I just scolded, talked about hemp, made it sound like a horse, or talked about my mother, you know, all of those, depending on which tone you're using for ma, and the rest of that. So you do have to face that. On the other hand, when you're finding this level of, you know, homonyms in it, it's another test I have for being at least slightly suspicious that I'm not actually dealing with a real language or a real reconstructed language. It's begun to deviate so far from what I would expect in a real language. Okay, potential projects. Remember, I'm an archaeologist wandering around like a bull in a china shop, knocking things over, testing the foundations, if you wish. But what I like to try to do is spin out, you know, other topics. And these are areas that I have not seen much done in terms of comparative linguistics. And that is taking a serious look at semantic fields as a whole. And one, certainly cross-language semantic fields, comparing, you know, these certain semantic fields. I gave you, for example, cattle in Celtic, starting with Irish and working my way out, very, very superficial. What does it look like if you start comparing the others, particularly if you wanted to move into other areas that had important cattle economies, Indo-Iranian, for example, and places like that. How do they differ? How are they similar? Do they give us any hint as to what we are missing? And would we know it using whatever techniques we're looking at? Areas in which I really believe we need full semantic field analysis. One is domestic plants. Please, no more trees. We've done trees to death. Trees are sexy, trees are fun. I know people love to do trees, but how about all of the really hard stuff and the stuff that really affects an archaeologist attempting to assess what is going on? And that means not looking simply at what we will call the inherited lexicon. That is those few words that we can reconstruct to Proto-Indo-European, but what is the full range in Greek, Latin, etc.? Are we seeing any form of morphological structure, suffixing, anything that might get us a little bit closer to what the source is for the domestic cereals that we find in Indo-European, or the wild plants that may very well have been used either for medicinal or for nutritional purposes across the Indo-European languages. And these are big tasks. because unless you've got a reverse index, you're going to have to work your way through the whole bloody dictionaries to find these things out. Ceramics. Indo-Europeans had to move through a society that had ceramics. There are very few aceramic societies, and those are only for very minuscule periods in European prehistory, for example. To the best of my knowledge, we've got about really one serious word. Charo in Sanskrit, meaning a large vessel, which we can compare with Old Norse ver and Old Irish quera, meaning cauldron in both of those, which of course is a large vessel, but by the time it's hit Germanic and then Celtic, it seems to be referring to a metal vessel. That's pretty well it. The number one item that an archaeologist is going to encounter is going to be ceramics. That's going to be it, across the site. And consequently, there must have been tremendous numbers of terms for these. And so what do we have? What has survived when we take a look at the full range? Architecture was one of the areas in which regional developments seem to be very strong. Frequently, these are with reference to posts, poles, roofs, rafters, things like this. So, architectural tradition across Indo-European languages. And of course, social organization, which is being carried out here and taking a look at. All of these areas at least interact with archaeologists in which we can carry on a dialogue. And I always think the interesting thing is to start with known languages where we have total control to see how a language should behave, and then we take a look at the proto-language to see what we've got. And finally, for the really ambitious, cross-proto-language analysis. And by that, you take a look at Indo-European, you take a look at Uralic, Altaic, Proto-Salish, Athabascan, Uto-Aztecan. How do the reconstructed proto-languages behave? Because there are two things operating here. One is that they are getting only attenuated reality of what was in original languages. And what I hope I've shown you here, they're only getting the smallest fraction of what must have really existed in their respective Bronze Ages or Neolithic or whatever we're taking them from. And the second process is to what extent are all we getting is artifacts created by philologists. And this is where I was talking about red balloon proto-languages, that is where we're getting nothing but verbal roots or adjectives that provide convenient linking points to tie God knows how many other words to, when in actual fact, they probably have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the original language. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mallory. Now we'll have about 10, 12 minutes for questions. Adam, I think you were first.
Yes, I think I have some suggestions for parts of the reasons for the patterns you find when you compare Indo-European, Uralic, and Nostratic, and the red balloon appearing especially in Indo-European and the many verbs in Nostratic. I think it partly has to do with language typology and partly with methodology, because contrary to Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, for Proto-Uralic, you usually when you reconstruct a root, it's a root that can also be an independent word without suffixation.
Yeah.
So usually when you reconstruct a plant name, for example, it's both a root and the full plant name. Whereas in Indo-European, when you reconstruct, we reconstruct a language where most roots cannot be independent words. We have a small category of roots which can function as independent words, so neuter root nouns and so on, but they're a very limited number. So I think when you form new words in Indo-European, you usually use a root and then a different number of suffixes. And when you reconstruct, you would usually end up reconstructing a root behind these derivatives, and that root will very often be more abstract and more verbal than in languages of a different typology where the roots can also function as independent words. So when you, for example, when you leaf through the Uralic etymological dictionary, you will very often see that the proto-reconstruction, the semantics of the reconstructed root very often is retained in all of the languages, in all Uralic languages, whereas in Indo-European it's very often a root with different suffixes and different meanings. So for example, a plant name can be very accurately the same plant all over the Uralic area. And the second reason, I think, that has to do with Nostratic, and that has to do with the fact that you, in this case, you have used Alan Baumhart's dictionary, and I think Alan Baumhart's interest in Nostratic started out with an interest in comparing Indo-European and Semitic and Afro-Asiatic, which is of the same language type in this respect, namely that it's also a language with a lot of abstract roots from which you can form more concrete words. So again, very contrary to Uralic. I think in Baumhart's work and in many other works about Nostratic, it has mainly arisen from an interest in comparing Afro-Asiatic to Indo-European, and they have kind of forgotten all the Siberian and Altaic vocabularies. They have kind of been added later when you've already established an Indo-European Semitic correlation. So I think these might be parts of the reasons why you end up with
I think they're going to be part, but I think also once you go down this route of the verbal things, because going through Alan Baumhart's dictionary, the Indo-European, he uses a regional isogloss for arrow, takes it back to move. Now, I could, what are the chances of me not being able to come up with an etymology if that is the level at which I'm operating at? And this is why I've become somewhat skeptical that it's almost impossible to falsify the etymologies when they are tied to pretty abstract verbal roots then in the end, because we can always almost generate an explanation that will move this, into a particular category.
I think Professor Jasper.
Well, I had a little thought when it comes to ceramics and vocabulary relating to ceramics, because there is, of course, we may also, of course, look for verbs that are not necessarily red balloon verbs, but are quite specific in the meaning, that have a relevance archaeologically, perhaps, because there is, for instance, a root, or there's a cluster of roots got up, but I'm thinking in particular of one root, peik, which is used in a very specific sense, the meaning to depict, to engrave, to paint, but it's also in some cases used specifically for symbolic behavior. So it is also in Vedic, for instance, it is also used metaphorically to talk about poetry. Pinshati, so what you do with your voice when you compose poetry. So this might be something that have an interest, because I suppose that the ceramics that you find are either painted, they are engraved, different patterns are being used, but the same kind of symbolic behavior lies behind this activity, no matter which specific technique you're using.
Yes, well, it takes back to Picorni's old article, Fingo Pingo Tseke Peke, and that he thought the Indo-European homeland therefore had to be the linear bond ceramic, because we had this dualism between I shape and I paint, which actually linear bond ceramic would not be quite appropriate. It would have been better to do it to the Balkans or something like that. If we're assuming what we're going here, actually it would be difficult. The steppe cultures have unpainted wares. The Tripolia culture, their neighbors, plaster their pottery with paint and things like that. Don't get me wrong, I don't believe, I'm not going to sit there. I have never said I don't believe in verbs. I simply believe that there is probably we take a look at what the range is between reconstructed roots that are going to be verbal and use that perhaps as a criteria for wondering to what extent is it becoming overly, it's a creation of the method rather than the actual proto-language.
Yes, sir. Professor.
Hi, Jim, it was a really stimulating talk, thank you. I just, the number of retained Proto-Indo-European roots for cow, going back to that, compared to the Irish vocabulary for cows, was about, it looked like we lost 90% of the cow vocabulary, if that was representative. So, did you do that kind of thing for other words? I mean,
No.
I'm wondering whether a 90% loss is something that might operate across different semantic fields, or if there are some semantic fields that retain better than that.
This is why I was suggesting these are the things that should be tested. I would never start with Irish, the gift of the gab. I'm afraid if you take a look at Irish medieval manuscripts, particularly by the late Middle Irish period, they cannot put a noun up without putting 20 adjectives in front of it in order to, I assume, bore their audience completely to death. And that any one of those adjectives, once nominalized, becomes the meaning at the end. So there, I can't remember, I did a count, and there's something like 20 or 30 words for spears. But many of them are transferred meanings from one thing to another. The reason why, like the cattle, this is where I would have thought cross comparison.
Yeah.
This is where you go among modern Mongolian or anybody who is raising livestock. What are the semantic categories that you absolutely should expect among such people? That probably tells you what you're missing. Now, I always worry about this. There's two reasons. Once you know what you're missing, you're going to probably want to shove whatever you've got into the different categories to fill them up. So it looks more real. And therefore, those words like the Tauros word, which is either bull or wild cattle or something like that, move solidly into one or the other. And that type of a thing. In other words, it's wish fulfillment.
Yeah.
The second problem I find regarding all of this, and this is the attrition of the words, is that what are we actually reconstructing? The problem with proto-languages is that the time depth of a proto-language is going to be really horribly vague. And if in italic we get almost no or very little words for inherited domestic plants, does that mean, and I'll put it, let's say if I was Colin Renfrew up here, yes, they had all of those words when they first came in, but by the time of the Iron Age, by the time we actually have documented things, we've had a lot of language change, we've had collapses of, semantic fields and things like that. Or does one argue, look, the agricultural vocabulary of Indo-European looks pretty unstable, pretty weak. And therefore, while Indo-Europeans in their expansion had agriculture, they did not have a long, complicated history of settled agriculture of all of these different plants necessarily. And they were perfectly willing, every time they saw a cereal, we'll call it a grain. Or lift whatever word we had before, barley or wheat. I mean, one of the words there, it can mean wheat, barley, rye, or bread. Pick. What's the proto meaning of that?
I think we had one last question over here.
That's not really a question, actually. I completely agree with you. Yes, particular linguists have maybe been way too uncritical of our method. if you look at the fish names, you see that people tend to derive dozens of fish names from the root to shine. This is of course not impossible, but you shouldn't exploit that possibility to derive every single fish word from to shine. Yeah, I really do believe it creates a lot of artifacts. But I also agree that looking at semantic fields can be really interesting. I've done it myself in my own talk as well. So if you look at the stratification of the lexicon in Germanic, you can easily see that those words that are associated with agriculture, they are actually irregular, and it's impossible to reconstruct their Indo-European form, like the word for P we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And I know many people who refuse to actually accept actually the whole idea that words from non-Indo-European languages can enter in European languages. I mean, I know a professor who actually rather prefers to derive the word for P from evening than to accept that it might be a loan word from an agricultural culture. I mean, this is the state of Fahrenheit right now, and I think it's actually embarrassing.
Would you reveal the name of the professor?